Welcome to Mushroom Wonderland.
Looks like we're off and running. My name is Ahilliard. As he mentioned, I am the creator of Mushroom Wonderland on YouTube. Been the vice president here for a couple years now. And yeah, like David said, we put together this kind of the Aristotle's 5 W's of fungi. So who, what, why, where, and when of mushrooms. So welcome to the 2023 mushroom season. There's David, president. I'm the vice president of the club right now. We have elections coming up at the end of the year, so if anybody wants to run for positions on the board, it's a good time to ask around about that. So this talk is kind of geared towards the beginner forager, but also just anybody. I hope it's just interesting. We've never done it before, so it might be a little clumsy, but I think it'll be really entertaining. The 5 W's of fungi, an introduction to mushrooms. The first W is who. Who uses mushrooms? Mycophagy, the act of consuming mushrooms, dates back to ancient times. There's archaeological sites in Chile that have been found with associations to edible mushrooms from 13,000 years ago, but no doubt people have been eating mushrooms and using mushrooms since the dawn of time. This one of the older depictions, the tassili mushroom figures in Algeria. This is like northern Africa, date back 7,000 to 5,000 BC. These are 2 different depictions that were found in caves. They're kind of disputed. Some people would say that they're flowers, but I think that the general consensus is that that this guy's depicting different mushrooms, perhaps magical psychedelic mushrooms. The Selva Pascuala is an archaeological site in Spain, and these depictions of mushrooms are up here, are on the cave wall. And because of some of the crooked stems, they're thought to be depictions of Psilocybe hispanica. And so, really hard to find. This picture down here was from Alan Rockefeller. This is actually the herbarium type species of the Psilocybe hispanica. Hard to find one. It's thought to be synonymous with the other Psilocybe mushrooms, but nonetheless, 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, it looks like they were starting to use those. Otzi the Iceman, made famous in one of Paul Stamets' talks. They found this mummified remains of a guy in the mountains of Austria who had 2 types of mushrooms on him. The one on the left, Fomes fomentarius, known as the tinder conch, so you could take a small piece of an ember of fire and stash it inside that mushroom and carry it for a couple days and then relight your fire. Was a really valuable thing, so he carried one of those. And then the Fomitopsis betulina, they found that in his system. They said that was probably to help ward off parasites. So he was quite a forager, and he was all about his mushrooms. So ethnomycology, people using mushrooms. Since the dawn of time, people have foraged mushrooms for food. I took this picture at the Pike Place Market, wild porcini, wild lobster mushroom, matsutake. If you look at those prices, that's from like 5 years ago too, so $50 a pound. Right there, Agaricus Augustus in the middle, one of my favorite ones to eat. Top right corner was last year a really good flush of winter chanterelles, and then there's a steak with some chanterelles because we all like eating mushrooms. Penicillium, was discovered around 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. They started making cheese that long ago with Penicillium roquefortii. So it's more of it's a fungi, but not the kind that produces a large fruiting body like a mushroom, but nonetheless fungi. And then Saccharomyces. This is the fungus used to make bread and beer, basically yeast. Saccharomyces cerevisiae used 6,000 BCE in Mesopotamia when they started leavening bread with it, and the Saccharomyces pastoranus used to make beer since about 800 BCE. So, as medicine, penicillin was first used on a policeman as recent as 1941 when they really discovered what penicillin was. It was a game changer. One of the most powerful antibiotics ever discovered happens to be a fungus. Chinese used Ganoderma species. Ganoderma These lacquered conchs, there's quite a few different species of it. They've been using it as medicine for over 2,000 years. They call it the mushroom of immortality, or Lingxi. This one, I took this picture in Bremerton, Washington, of this Ganoderma oregonense. Looks like E.T. trying to beam something up, and they grow on logs. This is a good time of year to find them, and they're an annual mushroom. This will just rot and go away, and then next summer new ones will start growing if you find the right logs. Big conifer logs like to be host to these mushrooms, and the lacquer look to it is actually the same chemical compound as actual lacquer that they use on furniture. This one I just like to put in all the presentations because everybody thinks it's the coolest mushroom, and these are actually pretty common around here in the autumn when it gets really soggy. This one, Hydenellum pepii, or the bleeding tooth fungus. I took these pictures in South Kitsap a couple of years ago, and that red guttation is not blood. It's just pigmented water, basically. And I've licked that off of there before. It's kind of peppery and spicy, but it's not a toxic mushroom, and it's really inedible because it's tough, kind of like tree bark or something. Hydenellums have teeth that hang down underneath, not gills or a pore surface. And these have been studied for medicinal uses. They have an anticoagulant that could be useful, so they're undergoing studies right now. But a really photogenic mushroom and a fun one to find. Trametes versicolor, one of the easiest ones to identify. The turkey tail mushroom has been used for a long time, and it is the most studied mushroom in the world for medicinal purposes. It's got these concentric color bands on it, sort of a fuzzy top, and then it's going to have a white pore surface underneath. And they come in a variety of colors, hence the name versicolor. So these are both Trametes versicolor, even though these ones are more blackish blue. Those were found on Green Mountain, and these ones were found near McCormick Woods over here, and they were more orange with green bands. I thought that was really cool. I heard Christopher Hobbs, who's a PhD in Telluride, say that the ones that have more black in them are more medicinal. So I don't know, something to think about. Lion's mane, Hericium erinaceus. People have been using this. You can get it powdered and in all kinds of forms. I'm just kind of off on a little sidebar right now, but this one was found in Bremerton, Washington last year, and they're somewhat rare around here, so it was really exciting to see a lion's mane like that growing. And somebody cultured it, and it's growing in a lab somewhere in Oregon now, the same exact mushroom. It's kind of cool. People have been using mushrooms for spiritual purposes, namely hallucinogenic mushrooms. There's some pictures of psilocybe mushrooms. In the bottom right corner, a depiction of a gal named Maria Sabina that became really famous in the 50s when a mycologist went to Mexico to discover these magical mushrooms. And his name was Dr. Gordon Wasson, a really great mycologist, but he went there with all good intentions and experimented with these mushrooms, came back, Life magazine wrote a big article, and basically a bunch of hippies flocked down to Mexico, and the people there got mad at us, and it kind of ended up in a disaster, and she said that she regretted ever doing that. But up to that point, they were using them very spiritually, and mushrooms have been used like that since for, thousands of years. Recreationally, so you go to any Grateful Dead concert, somebody in the parking lot's probably going to ask if you want some shrooms. That's what those are. That's actually a mushroom in the bottom right corner. This is what genetic alteration has done to these mushrooms over the years. That crazy blob is actually a descendant of these ones on the left that are just a boring cap and stem mushroom. In the middle is a picture I took from the Telluride Mushroom Festival of their little mushroom truck, and there's a huge parade, thousands of people. People gather from all around just to celebrate fungi, kind of like what we're doing here tonight. Fabric dyeing, people use them to dye fabric. There's people in here who are into it. This is a picture of a Pisolithus erizus, or the dead man's foot, and I found this one just 2 weeks ago, and that's a cross section of it. It's pretty cool inside the middle there. Right down here in the bottom left corner, Tapenella atrotomentosa, or the velvet-footed pax, and then next to it is a dyer's polypore, Phaeolus schweinitzii, and then this fabric on the top right corner, all of those fabrics and hats and scarves you see, that's all done with mushroom dye. So it's a whole thing, if you're unfamiliar with that. And right now, as you get, even though it's super dry out, the dyer's mushrooms are out. So you can find all three of these growing right now. But the first one, the dead man's foot, or it's also known as a dog turd fungus, because it can really just look like a turd on the ground until you realize that it's a mushroom. People have been using mushrooms for arts and crafts. In the top left corner, Trametes versicolor, the turkey tails we talked about, people make paper out of it. And then on the top right, the inky cap, you can actually turn those into ink for writing. And so you could take your ink from the inky cap and then draw on your turkey tail paper. Maybe you could even draw a mushroom. That'd be pretty mushroomy. And then, the bottom, this is Chlorocyboria aeruginascens, or the blue-green elf cup. And it dyes wood this blue-green color. If you've ever been walking in the forest and you see a stick or a log that's a bluish-green color, that's due to a fungus. And in Italy, for 600 years or more, they've been making woodwork trinkets and stuff out of Chlorocyboria. Those 3 trinkets were made by my friend Adam, and they whittle them and sell them at mushroommarauder.com. Kind of a cool little way to use that wood. It's really a unique color and a pretty cool deal. So people have used mushrooms for myco remediation, to help break down garbage at dumps, to filter water runoff from farms, to degrade toxic chemicals. They've been able to grow these oyster mushrooms here on a pile of rags soaked in diesel, and the mushrooms will still grow and start to convert those rags back into organic usable material. So a lot of study still left to do on myco remediation, but people are seeing a value in fungus for that. Myco-herbicides, people use mushrooms as a herbicide. So this one, Crondosterium purpureum, the silverleaf fungi. I took that picture at North Kitsap Regional Park, and it was grown on the side of a maple tree. And when you see that, it means that tree is on its way out, and it's really contagious. So it'll get onto other trees. This is a nightmare for like fruit farmers and orchard growers. If they see the silver leaf pop up, it can be a real bad thing. But they make it into a myco-herbicide, and then they can smear it on the base of weed trees to kill them, which is kind of cool. So if you have a neighbor who's got a tree that's blocking your view, I'm just saying, don't do that. Trichoderma, common green mold, everybody knows what that is, but it can be used as a herbicide as well. So who are the who's who in mushroom history? In ancient Rome, around the beginning of Christianity, one of the most notorious crimes, when Emperor Claudius was poisoned by his empress with death cap mushrooms. It was said that she put mushroom juice from the death caps into the Caesar mushrooms, and he ate them up and died. So kind of a famous story of one of the emperors being poisoned to death. Pope Clement VII was killed of accidental mushroom poisoning in 1534. This story's going on right now, if anybody's been following this, and I just threw it in there because I thought it was interesting. But this gal invited her ex's whole family over for a luncheon and accidentally put death caps in the meal, and mysteriously she didn't eat it, or her kid, but 4 of the people that were there got poisoned. I think 3 of them died. And the story has kind of gone cold, but this is currently happening. They found her dehydrator in the dump that was thrown there the day after, so they got the dehydrator, and so they're going through lab work to see if they can find evidence of Amanita phalloides in the dehydrator. And there's videos of her. Anyways, it's an interesting story, so something to look into right now. I just think mushroom poisoning is so fascinating. So, two different kinds of people in the world. The mycophilic cultures. The cultures China, Southeast Asia, and Russia are mycophilic. These are cultures that love mushrooms. They've celebrated mushrooms. They've been eating mushrooms. They like to try different varieties of mushrooms. And then the mycophobic countries, which we actually fall into that category in America. For the most part, people are scared of mushrooms, and they've been told that kind of comes from Old World Northern Europe, fear of toadstools and whatnot, and then Old World superstition and things like that. And so if you go to a market, an Asian market in Southeast Asia, they're going to have like 30 different varieties of mushrooms that you could choose from. And if you go to an American grocery store, we have one mushroom, because we're still scared of mushrooms. So part of what we do here is to help educate and alleviate that fear that there really aren't that many deadly mushrooms, and it's okay to handle mushrooms, and it's okay to be fascinated by mushrooms. This is a name you should probably know, Elias Magnus Fries. He was like the king of mycology, basically. He wrote this system of mycologicum, and he basically classified the taxonomy of mushrooms. Before that, basically everything was in the genus Agaricus, and then nobody put much attention to him because he's from one of these mycophobic countries. But thank goodness for some of these scientists that cared about mushrooms, and he started to break them down by spore color by guild or pores. He really like kind of wrote the book on mushroom taxonomy. And there's just so many other who's in mushroom and in mycology and taxonomy that I can't even go over the list, but he's kind of one of the godfathers. Blank slide. I'm sorry?
When did he live?
He was from 1794 to 1878, so he lived a pretty long life. And he did a lot of good stuff, but he wrote this 3-volume, just a masterpiece on mushroom taxonomy. So somebody to look up. What is a mycologist? Somebody who studies fungus. Work in laboratories, university. Usually one needs a PhD in molecular biology to be labeled as a mycologist, but the term is getting pretty loose these days. Mushroom cultivators can be called mycologists. Some mycologists work only in the lab and they never actually go out and look at any mushrooms. They just get them sent to them. Others work almost strictly in the field and never touch a piece of laboratory equipment. Citizen science has enabled many fungi enthusiasts to be called mycologists through contributions to science via the internet. So if you have a smartphone, which everybody pretty much does now, you can go to a site called iNaturalist. When you find a mushroom, you can take a picture of it and upload it, and you're actually contributing to science, and you can call yourself a mycologist, even though a PhD mycologist might scoff at you. So the who's who, it's us. We're responsible for the future of ethnomycology, the people in this room. So that's the who's who, and I'm going to turn it over to David. Oh, and that picture is from the mushroom show right there in the Bremer Student Center last year. We had it; it was pretty packed. So.
I'm sorry, I heard a question. Online?
Yeah, so there's a couple people trying to get onto the meeting. Can you check the waiting room?
Thank you very much. Can I see that? Okay. Bear with me, because they're not showing up on our screen here.
How about more on the right?
Well, see, they should be here under participants.
Maybe they sent them this.
I think when someone
They gave up.
There was like a prompt that showed up.
Was it Derek?
They might have.
I'm at the top, you're at the bottom. I'm sorry. I hate to lose folks, but I don't see them on here. They may have abandoned us.
Warren is there and Dan.
Dan's there.
I can see him.
Yep, no, I know, yeah, I'm not seeing the usual. Okay. Yeah. What is a mushroom? That's a mushroom. That's a really nice, hefty, tasty mushroom, and they finally popped up. I just want to bring a little reality, physical reality to what we're talking about. Right out there in the woods, right now, are a whole bunch of mushrooms. But the
Oh, there it is.
There's Derek.
He's the one.
Admit.
Oh, admit, somebody came back, okay. I'll do that, and I'll try to hit the admit, thank you. Because, as Aaron mentioned, once upon a time we didn't even know what mushrooms were. They were not that long ago classified as plants. Thank you. And they're not. Oh, what is this? There we go. First of all, a mushroom, you might be able to guess why there's an apple next to a big red mushroom.
You might have to speak up.
You
might have to speak up for the people.
Kidding? Why is an apple sitting next to a mushroom? What do they have in common?
They're fruit.
They are both fruits. What's not often recognized is that the mushroom is a fruit of an organism called the fungus. The fungus we don't usually see because it's pretty small. It consists mostly of microscopic little tendrils maneuvering through its ecosystem and digesting things. But every once in a while, the fungus pops up a mushroom. And many fungi don't, but that's what they are. And we're used to mushrooms, yeah, sort of looking like this. A big, nice, rounded brown dome, some sort of interesting spore-bearing body, just a spore-bearing surface just underneath the cap, and then a handsome little stem, and it's growing up out of the ground. That's kind of our traditional view of mushroom, but the other thing to realize is mushrooms take on a million different forms. Broadly, the kinds of mushrooms out there fall into three categories I've just kind of declared. People who actually are mycologists will scoff at the way I've organized them because I'm blurring things a little bit. But when you're in the woods, it's best to think of, it's useful to think of three different habitats and ecosystems and lifestyles that mushrooms and fungi have adopted to get along. Because like everything else, they're just trying to make their way in the world by consuming food and by reproducing. And they don't have the same setup as plants, which are in a different kingdom, or as animals, which are in a third kingdom. The fungal kingdom works it out this way. They, these little tendrils nudge up against biological materials, against organic materials, and absorb useful, digest, absorb, dissolve useful nutrients into themselves and turn that into food and make a living from that. And when they want to make offspring, they somehow, through force of hydrology, they push up some sort of elaborate mushroom which has spores on it, and each of which has its own way of getting those spores off into the world. Maybe they expect an animal to eat it, maybe they expect the wind to catch the spores, maybe they expect someone to kick it over and knock it down the hill, and that produces the spore reproduction cycle. The one we're looking at on the screen is a good place to start. One of the first places that you see mushrooms after a forest fire is on dead trees, on burned trees. This particular weird mushroom, whose scientific name I forget because I have a hard time with Latin, I call it the clown nose mushroom. This looks like a clown nose. This is part of, if you look it up, a very elaborate game that this particular fungus plays with the local environment, and in combination with certain beetles which like to visit recently killed trees, it has this weird life cycle of beetles and these strange little mushroom nests that the beetles like to hang out in, and carrying the spores in and out spreads it to the next dead tree. This looks very similar, and it's a completely different way of digesting wood. This first category, the wood digesters, are all the different ways that mushrooms and fungi have figured out a way to go after dead and dying wood material. This is a very young version of, I think, of a red-belted conch, which if you step into the woods around here is most likely the most common mushroom out there because they live forever, and every dead tree eventually succumbs to, among other things, a red-belted conch. This mushroom pops out and lives there and hangs on there and gets bigger and bigger and bigger for sometimes decades. And it also has this weird property that you're seeing here. It's covered with water, covered with droplets of water. Not because it rained, but because there's a weird word called guttation. As part of its digestion of the wood, it sometimes generates wastewater, which it has to kick out to the surface by just making the mushroom sweat. So not an uncommon sight in the woods during certain parts of the year to see mushrooms sweating like that. Yet another way of digesting the wood is the varnish conch that Aaron mentioned. It looks a lot like the red-belted conch, except it does all of this life cycle in a year. Each one of these mushrooms pops out of the wood, reproduces, drops its spores, and then shrivels up and dies in the course of less than a year. Just a completely different model for how you digest a big chunk of wood. Yet another mushroom that doesn't look like a mushroom. This is in the genus Hericium. This sometimes is called bear tooth or bear head or bear face. I don't know. It's delicious, and you find these growing on especially large, especially old conifers, especially at higher elevations around here. It's really tasty. And yet another way of eating wood, yet another fungus has figured out that produces a reproductive body that can't really last more than a couple of weeks, right? It's barely supporting itself, and if we have a drought, it goes away. There's several like this that are orange and jelly-like and just are goopy on the side of a conifer. This is the conifer tuft mushroom. You will often see these spreading up the side of an old stump at a certain point in that stump's decay. They're bitter and poisonous.
Wait, that would be the sulfur tuft.
The sulfur tuft.
The conifer tuft is okay to eat. They're very close look-alike, though.
So what should I tell people? Eat this one or not?
I think that was a picture of a conifer tuft, which is the Capnoides, Hyphiloma capnoides, which is a good edible, but it looks so much like Hyphiloma fasciculare that if you're kind of new, it's better to avoid them altogether. It's not deadly, but it'll make you wish you hadn't eaten it for sure.
So just to be clear, I'm not eating these.
Yeah.
Yet another model for how you digest wood is the turkey tail. It's flat, it's got a million little pores on the underside. This one's, do you agree, medicinal?
Mm-hmm.
It's medicinal.
Absolutely.
It is used for medicinal purposes. Aaron, I think it's a honey mushroom.
That's right.
It's a honey mushroom. So, a species of, I have a tough time with this because there's a similar one that I mislabeled for a good long time. But the cool thing about the honey mushroom, which again, yet another species that's trying to figure out how to digest wood, somewhere in eastern Oregon is said to be a fungus that is simultaneously the largest fungus in the world and the oldest fungus in the world. It is the species of the honey mushroom, and you can find mushrooms popping out of it, covering on trees, dead trees, spanning something like 25 square miles. And they know this because they've done the genetic studies all over the plot, and they're all the same individual.
You got an admittance waiting room.
Thank you. Yet another way of digesting a tree is the oyster mushroom. This is a particularly lovely collection of them that were all simultaneously perfect, and which I harvested in about 5 minutes flat and took home and turned into mushroom bacon. Highly recommend. Looking very similar at first glance, but a completely different species. Yet another way of digesting wood was figured out by what we call chicken of the woods, which, I'm sorry, to me it looks a lot more like candy corn. Not always directly on the dying tree, often hanging off the roots. Is a whole bunch of wood-eating mushrooms, like this one, the cauliflower mushroom, which someone's already found this year. and brought a sample in if people want to see it. Aaron mentioned that even though it's been fairly dry this summer, you already right now can find most of the dye mushrooms in the woods. This is a dye mushroom. This is a young Dyer's polypore. It's got these lovely, colorful rainbow concentric rings. Most oddly, most of the dye mushrooms are tapped into old stumps, which are tapped into deeper water, which still have moisture in them, so that even in a dry summer, the dye mushrooms, many of them, are still doing just fine on their host log, stump, tree. And so right now is when they're looking like this one. So those were all mushrooms who have figured out, fungi, who have figured out how to digest the cells of wood and turn it into food and turn it into a lifestyle. There's a whole another category of mushrooms that have nothing to do with killing things. And those are the ones that partner instead with trees and have a completely different relationship in the forest that you just stepped into. The chanterelle is found. Could somebody mute themselves? The
Oh, yeah.
could you mute yourself?
All right, Dad, I'll let you eat chicken wings. I'm going to eat one of these chicken legs.
Recommended, apparently.
Participants, and then you can mute everybody.
Whoever's eating chicken.
I think they did.
Mute all.
Mute all.
The power.
Except for me. Okay. Okay, so. Okay. Click out. Come on. X out of that. So the chanterelle is usually found out between the trees. It's, if you're lucky, found out in relative open of the woods, found out in at the wood duff, the needle duff, or popping up from the moss. Well, what's it doing there? It's actually deep down, hooked into the root system of a nearby conifer. And it's got a great deal, a lifelong deal with the conifer. The conifer, year-round, because it's green year-round, is making carbohydrates year-round, because that's what plants do. And it is sending some of its carbohydrates out into its roots, and knows that mushrooms, some fungi, like the chanterelles, have tapped into it. And are tapping into the carbohydrates and using them to feed this fungus and its mushrooms all its life. And in exchange, in a classic symbiotic relationship, what's the mushroom doing for the tree? It's got its own network of fibers, like just beneath the surface of the soil, spread out like a skirt that extends well beyond what the roots can normally capture, and it's capturing water and minerals in its own little fibrous system, and pumping them in and putting them into the roots to go back up into the tree. So the tree gets water and minerals in exchange for its carbs, and vice versa for the mushroom. And
Yeah, right there.
this relationship lasts simultaneously for the lifetime of both. You cut down that tree, and the mushroom and fungi are dead. If you somehow were to kill off all the fungi relationships, the tree would quickly wilt, I think. There's a whole bunch of mushrooms that do the same thing.
Just click anywhere on that screen, and then the arrows will work.
Yeah, well. Yeah, as you said.
There you go. Doesn't it work now? No.
No, I'll just scroll. Another mushroom that we love here, the porcini, the king bolete, has the same kind of relationship, also with nearby conifers. We have springtime ones, and we have fall ones that slightly separate species. But if you run across them, it's because they are connected to the root systems nearby. You're not going to find these out in the middle of the driveway or out in the middle of the field because they need a tree nearby. Families of mushrooms living under the spruce trees up in the mountains. Deep in the moss, the matsutake. Now, this one looks like it's way out in the moss, and it is, but it's called a pine mushroom for a reason. At least in Japan, it's because there's a pine tree nearby that it's hooked into. Here, it's a lot more happy to symbiotically relate to other species. I think fir most of the time. The grand fir in the Cascades, just east of the Cascades, are a favorite hookup for the morel mushroom. And so where we find those typically is in the duff, 5, 10, 15, 20 feet out from a big old fir tree. The lobster mushroom, same deal, because the lobster mushroom and the russula, which is a type of russula mushroom in disguise, are also out in between the trees, doing symbiotic duty with a nearby, typically conifer. Now, the interesting thing is that the mycologists say that each of those trees has relationships with multiple species, and that each of those species may be connected with multiple trees. They may be communicating with each other this way. These mushrooms that are out in the middle between the trees, they pop up on some sort of random whack-a-mole schedule. It's kind of hard to figure out. But typically, the mushroom itself is popping up right on now. When the temperature starts to drop and the rainfall starts to rise, something in the fungus decides, okay, this is when we're going to try to reproduce. So those are the mushrooms that are busy working with the trees. That's what a mushroom is in that little grouping. There's also mushrooms that you're probably not going to find actually in the woods and not necessarily anywhere near a tree. And those are the ones who are a lot more gregarious. They're just decomposers. They're just looking for a meal. And they set up, the fungus sets up nice broadly wherever they think they might get food, and the mushroom pops up somewhere in that vicinity where they think they can distribute the spores. Puffballs. They're just out there decomposing something. Puffballs. Out in the grass, in a campground. Shaggy manes, out in a meadow, really, middle of nowhere in eastern Washington, just eating whatever is down there. And they don't necessarily pop up in the same place every year. Here's a cup fungus, whose name I always forget. It grows in my garden. It grows in my garden every year. It grows right next to where we had peas.
That's why it's called Peziza.
Disease.
Right by your peas.
By the peas, that must be why. My guess is it figured out some sort of, hey, hanging out and digesting last year's old roots. Kind of me. These are called chip cherries because they grow with chips and because they look like cherries. You will often find them in the garden or in landscaping. Here's a morel. But it's right next to like the irrigation tube in my garden, and in the chips and in the background you can see some plastic sheeting. This is a morel that came in with some wood chips and will just pop up this year and not be there again next year. It just found some food on the wood chips and will digest it and go away. The mushrooms that are just decomposing whatever is handy. I think this is a wood ear. Is this a wood ear? No.
No,
Okay.
I'm not sure what that is.
Not sure what it is. Looks like a wood ear.
Wood ears grow on wood, the auricularia ones.
Okay. So this is a shaggy parasol. It's one of the tastiest mushrooms out there. You find them all over the place. You'll find them in parks. You'll find them on the edge of the woods. You'll find them on the edge of the road. You'll find them here, right next to the chicken coop. So I didn't pick them. I let the chickens have them. They like them. And I will admit I have zero idea what these little babes are called. They are about a centimeter tall. But again, they're just growing out there in the soil where they found something pretty common to eat, and then they probably won't be there again next year. Speaking of eating anything, this this fungus eats fir cones. It specializes in fir cones. So at some point in the fall, you'll walk through the woods, and every darn fir cone will have these little white mushrooms popping up. Because that's what that particular organism has chosen to eat. Some fungi eat mushrooms. This is a blackening russula that's really blackened, that's being consumed now by a fungus in it that popped up its own little baby mushrooms. This is a mushroom that's growing out of horse poop, because that's what it does for a living. This is a mushroom that looks like an expensive Finnish licorice candy. I got no idea what it is. It's not well known because it grows in February. And nobody's out hunting mushrooming in February.
Pseudoplectania, yeah.
Then there's the things you look at, like, remember my topic here is what's a mushroom? Well, these aren't. Sometimes you think they are. So every once in a while you go walking through mushroom habitat and you'll see this, what looks like a scoop of, I don't know, rice? Bad rice? Yeah, or someone's last night's dinner. And if you touch it, you'll quickly regret it. It's really squishy and wet. And if you smell your finger after you've touched it, you'll really regret it. Because it's called slime mold, feels like a slime mold, and it smells like mildew. And they last out there for, I don't know, a couple days, maybe a week until they dry out. And they come in all sorts of attractive colors. But that is not a mushroom. It's growing on top of a stump, like a lot of mushrooms. It's yellow, like a lot of mushrooms. It's a slime mold. It's not a mushroom. You can ignore it. This is one of my favorite not mushrooms. It's called a ghost pipe. You will often find this when you're out looking for matsutake, because they are one of the plants that produce no food of their own. They can't, and they have this plant is surviving by parasitizing fungi. And so out there where you're mushrooming, you may occasionally come across this plant, which is sort of reversed the whole story and is eating a fungus.
Mm-hmm.
And now you get air to that.
All right.
Thanks.
Really quick question. I'm wondering, you mentioned a lot, conifers, obviously. When we go out mushroom picking, we're only finding mushrooms typically around like Doug firs. And never ever see, with the exception of like Amanita's, around a cedar. Is there any particular types of edible mushrooms that are associated with
Stand by,
cedars?
because one of our topics is where, and I'm going to go into that.
Okay.
Thank you. Great question.
It's a good question. All right, so this section is why. What is the purpose of mushrooms? Why are they here? And hopefully we don't repeat too much of the same stuff, but you know what? Reinforcement is always good for education. So let's see why we have mushrooms. Some, but not all fungi help to decompose things, but that's not all they do. So saprobic, saprotrophic, saprophytic, those are all sort of synonymous. These mushrooms decompose, eat organic matter. For instance, the Pleurotus ostreatus, the oyster mushroom, these ones are a really dark cap when they first start growing. I grow these at home, and but as they get older, they turn more gray, and then they eventually even kind of turn a white color. But these are growing on hardwood pellets that you put in your Traeger grill, and I just soak them in some boiling water until they are saturated enough, and then you can just, I mean, the oyster mushroom is so hardy and prolific that you could just take a mushroom, basically throw it into that sawdust, and there's a good chance it'll myceliate and grow more mushrooms. So that one's the easy one to cultivate because it doesn't need a tree to associate with, like David was talking about. This one is one of the psilocybe mushrooms. This is a hallucinogenic mushroom that grows wild around here. Doesn't need a tree to grow with. This one is a decomposer, and it grows in our woodlands. And they're just really little and somewhat mild. But you know, when I was a teenager, we would find them in cow fields or in nice new lawns. And I remember a old hippie guy being like, we'd go out into the forest and find magic mushrooms. And I remember thinking, I don't think so, dude, you're picking the wrong ones or something. Well, it turns out he was right. He was probably picking these little guys, and you can find them in big clear cuts and stuff. Spiraceus radicata, the western cauliflower mushroom. These ones I found on Green Mountain a couple of years ago. Huge amount. There's a little cute one over there. One of the best edible mushrooms in my opinion. And one that David previously called like a unicorn, you know, because you don't, you know, you get lucky if you find one of these, and it's usually when you're out looking for something else, and then, oh, you know, there's always a beam of light shooting through the forest on it. Just like that, you know, it's dark everywhere except for that. Really good. A lot of people use them as a substitute for egg noodles, like in stroganoff. We do like, instead of yakisoba, like stir fry, but we use that for noodles. Really super good, or just sauteed on a steak. So mycorrhizal, these mushrooms live in symbiosis with plants and or trees. So I made this little graphic. There's amanitas on the left, there's chanterelles, sort of a visual aid of how the mycelium connects onto the root tips. And last fall, a mycologist from Oregon actually came up and met with me, and we went on a hike at night, and we climbed down into the leaf and pine needle duff and moved it away, and he showed me how the roots were actually connected to the mycelium. It was so cool. And so what's interesting about these mycorrhizal mushrooms is the spores can land and the mycelium might start to grow in the ground, but until it can hook up to a mature tree, it won't produce any fruiting body. So out in the middle of the field out here, there could be a big mycelium of Amanita muscaria, but because it hasn't found a tree to get the right nutrients, it just won't ever produce a fruit. So it's kind of a crazy situation. And mycorrhiza is thought to be a survival mechanism that evolved in fungus. They all used to be saprobes and just eat decaying matter, and some of these mushrooms discovered that if they grab onto these tree roots, they can get some food out of that, and no longer do they have to look for rotting stuff or the right perfect conditions, and then they became mycorrhizal. So there's actually still some amanitas out there that are free living, and they don't need a tree to hook up with, and so it's kind of interesting. There's also boletes that are like related to porcini that are free living. They didn't make that evolutionary jump to hook up with trees and plants, which is interesting. We're right in the middle of that process still, you know, it's always happening. Cantharellus formosus, the Pacific golden chanterelle, he showed a picture of that. These are a few different pictures that I've got over the years. Great mycorrhizal mushroom. You will not find this mushroom without finding its tree. So it makes it easy to find because the trees are huge. So you go find where the trees are. And in my experience, the trees need to be about 40 years old or bigger, probably around 15 inches around or so is where I start to find chanterelles. Anything smaller than that, usually not finding any chanterelles. This is undoubtedly the most popular wild edible mushroom because it's so easy to identify with its bright orange color. It's got decurrent gills that kind of run down the stipe here, and that's really indicative of a chanterelle. And they've got a kind of a sweet smell. that smells exactly like chanterelles to me. I don't know. Some people say apricots. I don't know. I don't smell that, but I think it's I mean, it looks like an apricot color, I guess. Maybe it's got something to do with that. I don't know. But I've heard there's some on the East Coast that truly do smell like apricots. I don't know. Boletus edulis, the porcini, this is my favorite edible wild mushroom by far, and they kind of have a small window of a season. They seem to like it when it gets really wet and it's still kind of warm out. Once it gets cold, they don't seem to come up anymore. These were all found in Kitsap County in South Kitsap, and they seem to like to associate with 5-needle pine trees. So the amount of needles on a pine tree will indicate its species. And the white pines around here with 5 needles seem to be a good host for these porcini. And they're just adorable. So, Tricholoma murielanum, the western matsutake, these also grow with the conifer trees in a mycorrhizal association. These are related to Tricholoma matsutake, which in Japan, these mushrooms will sell for like $100 a mushroom. They're like really highly prized. They think of them as aphrodisiacs, and they're used in ceremonial things. That part of the culture is sadly kind of starting to die, but there's still a commercial market for these here because people in Japan and Korea will buy them from us. And when I was a teenager, I used to go pick these for gas money and money to go party with, because there was somebody in Belfair that just set up a tent and they would pay you cash if you brought in mushrooms, which was really cool. And that really kind of got me into wild mushroom hunting when I realized I could make money off of it, you know. Then there's parasitic mushrooms, organisms that live on or in an organism of another species and benefits at the other's expense. We kind of covered a lot of these. Armillaria mela, this one, the honey mushroom. We have different species of Armillaria up here, but honey mushrooms near my house in downtown Port Orchard. There's a really cute house, and we walk down the alley walking our dogs, and they've got a nice little fruit tree orchard in their backyard, and these honey mushrooms were coming up in big clusters in their yard last year. And it's a sad thing because those trees are on their way out. When you see honey mushrooms showing up, they're gonna kill those trees eventually. So, and in that picture on the right is Mycena hematicus. That one's super cool. You could take a really sharp razor and cut it, and a little drip of blood will actually come out of it. And they're a little white gilled mushroom that grows on decomposing wood around here. I just think it's one of the coolest things. And what's even cooler is after you cut it and the blood comes out, you can leave it and it will heal itself back up. You can come 2 days later, cut it again, and it'll bleed again. I've actually cut one up so many times, had little scars all over it and stuff. Hypomyces lactiflorum, the lobster mushroom. This is a symbiosis, but it's a parasite. So hypomyces is a parasitic fungi that attack other mushrooms. So this is a host mushroom, the Rusula brevipees, a big, large, white, boring mushroom. David Aurora calls it the most boring mushroom in the forest. We are just lousy with them in the forest when it really starts to rain a lot. They can get really big. I have a picture somewhere of me sitting on one, like literally like a toadstool. It was like 18 inches around. But this other parasite, whether it's flying through the air or crawling through the dirt, I'm not really sure, but it attacks the Rusula brevipees. It contorts it. It takes over the gills. It changes the color, changes the smell, the flavor profile, everything. Turns it into a lobster mushroom. So it goes from a boring Rusula brevipees, which nobody here really eats. In Russia, they like to pickle them, and they're totally edible. But when it gets parasitized, then people really like them, I think, because of that vibrant color. These were all found in South Kitsap County. And, you know, some people would say that they think the parasites in the air lands on the fruiting bodies and then parasitizes them. But I've found some that were buried that were completely parasitized, which kind of would throw that out the window. Also, the same patches will come back year after year after year. So it's like the parasite is existing in the ground, right? But then again, in some of those patches, I'll find half parasitized mushrooms, where half of it will be lobsterized and the other half will be complete perfect gills of a Rusula brevipees. And it makes me curious if it's producing spores for both from the same mushroom. It's an interesting mushroom, one of my favorite ones. When you find them and they're bug free. We made some lobster mushroom chowder recently that was so good. And this summer was really good for them. Found a lot of lobster mushrooms all throughout the summer. And now they've kind of chilled out, but I think when we get another rain, they'll probably fruit again. Latiparus conifera cola, the chicken of the woods. There's a picture of me with one in the Hoh rainforest over there, little chicken nuggets. what we were calling those. And this is another one growing off of a down log. This one can be parasitic and saprotrophic, so it can start growing on a live tree and then kill it and then eat its decaying matter, or it can just take over a dead log. So kind of an interesting mushroom, really highly prized, edible. I actually just released a video where I taste tested this one, the Conifera cola, when I was young, and personally, it makes me want to throw up. Not a fan of it. Not a fan. So the rotters, the saprobes are here to break down dead organic material so it can be reused by nature. If without these mushrooms, it would just be like pick up sticks, logs would be all the way to the sky, right? It would look nothing like it is. So Fomitopsis mountsiae, the red-belted conch, is a brown rot decayer, and you always see this, probably the most common mushroom in the Northwest, growing on logs, trees, on the popular trails where they cut a log. On the end of it, you see these blobs growing on it, and then they guttate, and they got the sweat and everything. They're eating the cellulose from inside the log. All you see there is a fruiting body. That is not the fungus itself. That's just where it produces spores. Then the lion's mane, the Hericium erinaceus, that's a white rotter. So it's eating the other part of the log. It's eating the brown, the lignin in the log rather than the cellulose. So right here, this is kind of interesting, I thought, when I learned about this. Brown rot decayer, so the red-belted conch, even the Ganoderma that's a white rot decayer. The chicken of the woods is a brown rot decayer. And what it does is it eats all the cellulose out of the log and it leaves behind all of the lignin. So if you see a really well decomposed log in the woods, it looks like little cubical stacks of brown wood, and you can just slough it apart with your hand. It's because everything that tied all that together has been eaten by that fungus, and it only left behind the brown part. That's why it's called a brown rot decayer, which is kind of counterintuitive, because I would think a brown rot decayer would be eating the brown stuff, but it's not. It's eating the white stuff. So that part was confusing to me. Now the white rot decayers leave logs looking like this. You've seen this before, real stringy looking stuff rather than the cubical stacks of brown material. It leaves all the cellulose behind, and then it eats all of the lignin. So Ganoderma organense, the reishi mushroom, the lion's mane, a lot of these will just eat the brown stuff, leave behind this white stuff. So you might be more interested when you see a rotting log, when you go, oh look, a brown rot decayer ate all of that cellulose and just left behind a pile of little brown stacks. And all of a sudden this isn't working, so that's cool. Okay, I already did that one. Mushrooms do more than eat dead stuff. Mushrooms improve forest health through the wood wide web, and that was in that movie, Fantastic Fungi. And basically, the mycelium becomes a huge network underground, and it actually lets trees communicate with each other. One tree can warn another tree through the mycelium of the mushrooms about parasites and disease. Mushrooms feed animals and humans, obviously. They help to renew soil, like we talked about the oyster mushroom. Together with bacteria, fungi are responsible for breaking down organic matter, releasing carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus into the soil and the atmosphere. And so they do a lot more than just eat dead things. Everybody says they just eat dead stuff. That's not true. And there's a picture of me with a big Amanita muscaria that was growing next to the courthouse, just for fun, because that was a cool mushroom. And how come the arrows work? Okay, this is going to be David. So, all right, that's what are
All right. So this is an answer to the question of where am I looking for these? And I'm going to talk a lot about trees in a minute, but I want to talk more generally to acknowledge that one of the challenges in running a club with hundreds and hundreds of people who are enthusiastically interested in finding mushrooms is there's no one spot we can take you that can support hundreds of people looking for mushrooms. We talk about this a lot as a club, that really our goal is to teach you to catch a fish. Help you figure out where the mushrooms are likely to be, go explore, find your own spots, and then pick like crazy, because in a few years the loggers are going to cut it down. Sorry. But we would like to help you figure out what sort of habitat does support the kinds of mushrooms that you're interested in. Okay, we're just scrolling. All right. And a lot of it has to do with trees. What kind of tree is this? It's a cedar. If you don't know your trees, mushrooms give you an excellent opportunity, excuse, reason to learn a few tree identifications, the identification for a few trees around here. Because it really does matter what kind of woods you are in. Cedar are the bane of mushroomers, because basically, with a couple of very minor exceptions, there's no mushrooms under cedar trees. If you walk into a nice, damp, soothing cedar forest, you're not there for the mushrooms because there aren't any. I talked to a mycologist about this, who said, no, really, cedar trees do have a fungal mycelium relationship going. It's just that the particular species of fungi don't produce, associated with cedars, don't produce visible above ground mushrooms. So, despite the fact that I love cedar trees very much and climbed them a lot when I was a kid, oop, there we go. Sorry. Wonder how that happened. Cedar trees are not where you're going to find your mushrooms.
Parasols.
I know.
It's true.
You can find
Saprobes.
Saprobes.
Yeah.
Yes, there will be a few mushrooms eating the cedar tree. Instead, for whatever reason, fir trees are one of the most common evergreens we have in the Northwest, in the damp Northwest. Pretty sure that one's a grand fir. Pretty sure that one's a Douglas fir. They tend to be the trees where we find a huge percentage of the mushrooms that we're interested in. They tend to form the relationships with many of the edible mushrooms that we enjoy, and often are the host for a lot of wood decayers. And so if you are looking for a forest, if you are looking at a park around here that has trees, you want to focus on ones that have pretty mature fir trees. And go wander around in circles underneath the base of those trees. This will help. Those are fir cones. We call them pine cones, but the ones that are 2 inches long, 1.5 inches long, this shape, sitting on top of a bunch of fir needles, these are fir cones. And if you look up, it's a fir tree. And if you look around, this is where you actually are very likely to find a lot of interesting mushrooms. Often in the same forest nearby, often interspersed, are very similar trees, but with the much shorter needle, rounded needle, and these are hemlocks. Hemlock trees, too, play host to a lot of the mushrooms that we find most interesting. Hemlock cones, when you look down into the duff, are much shorter, but I find that once I'm in a conifer forest and I'm pretty sure it's just needles overhead and needles on the ground, I don't worry too much about whether it's a fir or a hemlock. They both seem to support the kinds of mushrooms that interest me. The pine tree, some mushrooms do favor the pine tree and vice versa. What usually stands out about the pine tree is that the needles are much longer and the cones are much bigger. Pine trees aren't as common here in sort of the inland Puget Sound region. They're much more common on the coast or in the crest of the Cascades. They're much, in eastern Washington, they are a dryland conifer. But nevertheless, you will find certain mushrooms favor those conifers. So In total, though, it's not all about the species of tree. It's also a lot about, I'll just say broadly, the landscape and habitat. I've got a few photos of places I found nice edible mushrooms, because it's really hard to find them, but I can describe some of their characteristics. The age of these trees, it's bigger than 6 inches, it's smaller than 2 feet across, it's somewhere in between. It's about 40 years old. These trees tend to be of an age that tend to support the mushrooms I'm interested in. The woods is not too bright, not too dark, it's mixed light. It's not burned, the ground doesn't get burned out at any given point because of the sunlight shining on it, neither is it soaking away. The trees have grown up in some sort of natural, semi-open space. Likewise, it's not been selectively harvested for the size of future trees. You'll often wander into a woods where, oddly enough, it's all fir trees and they're all exactly the same size and they're all spaced the same number of feet apart. And it's not necessarily a tree farm, but it was like a wild forest, a natural forest, that the lumber company has gone in and selectively thinned to grow their favorite trees. Kitsap County Parks is really good at this. You'll find a lot of their parks have been thinned. Problem is, it ends up casting too much light down on the forest floor and messing with the opportunity for nice, happy fungi. The shrubbery underneath is important. If you find yourself walking through a lot of grass, turn around. If you're walking through a lot of blackberries, turn around. If you find a lot of ivy, forget it. What you're looking for at your feet is low, scattered, native shrubbery. Ferns are really nice. Salal is really nice. Evergreen huckleberry, black huckleberry is really nice. Oregon grape is really nice. As long as you can see the ground, as long as it's native, it hasn't been disturbed. I think that's the main message of the understory is, has this land been heavily disturbed by humans for some reason or another that brought in a lot of those other invasive species? If not, it's more likely to be supportive of mushrooms. Water's really good for mushrooms. Water's really key to the production of most of the species we're looking at. And if you find yourself in a nice little swale, a nice little gentle slope on 2 sides, and a semi-permanent little stream dripping down the middle, it means that there's groundwater, a few feet or inches below the ground on either side, and the woods either side should be supportive of mushrooms. If there's an actual stream running down the middle with some water in it, especially in an ordinarily dry month, that's golden. That means there's permanent water there. That's just generally good for the habitat. If you're wandering through the landscape, I would tend to favor the places that are near the water rather than necessarily way up in the sky or dry in the rocks. Green moss is always really nice. Yellow moss, not so good. Green moss, dark green moss is very supportive of mushrooms. Not so much because the mushrooms are growing in that moss, but because they like the same conditions. They like moisture. Here's a patch of woods that looks kind of initially attractive, but isn't quite. It's really a pretty picture, really pretty environment. But the trees are too big, a little bit. Trees are a bit too far apart, a little bit. There is a river, 50 yards down that hill. But I've hiked this hill quite a few times now and never really found much of anything, except maybe hiding in the shadows underneath some of the bigger logs. Where the action is about 50 feet behind me, across a little road, down a little hollow, where it's a little bit darker, and the trees have not been selectively harvested, and I found a bunch of chanterelles there last week. So even within woods, many acres of woods, you can look around and find the patch that seems most conducive, and through experience, figure out where you're most likely to find them. Aaron mentioned 40-year-old trees. 40-year-old trees seem really good for developing the relationship with the symbiotic mushroom species that really like to produce mushrooms that we really like to eat. The problem with 40-year-old trees is loggers like them too. There seems to be something magic about that size of wood that, that's exactly what they want to send into the mills. This is last week in my bestest secret chanterelle patch. It's gone. They harvested about a week earlier, and in fact, we're still harvesting within earshot about a half mile down the road. I walked off, deeper into the woods there in the background and looked around. Sure, I found a few mushrooms, but it's really sad. It's just a fact of life that when you do find the patch that you really value and it somehow seems not to have been found by everybody else, eventually it'll go away. And every couple of years I lose one of my favorite patches. Yeah, there's a lot of people in this room who know exactly where this picture was taken. The club, for years, had a Thanksgiving weekend foray at Port Gamble. And one of the reasons that we had it there was we once had a foray of 60 people supported by the amazing, endless acres of mushroom territory at Port Gamble. And in a complicated story that's too painful to repeat, the county took over, accepted ownership, bought Port Gamble from the lumber company, and almost immediately, all the trees got cut down. So it'll come back. 50 years from now, there will be lots of chanterelles there again.
100 years.
100 years?
Yeah, I would say.
Okay. Great. Thanks. So my grandchildren's grandchildren. So this is why we tend to emphasize not taking our group out and finding the best place to find mushrooms, because that turns out to be a sucker's game. But instead, urging you to go find a nice patch on your own and keep going back as often as you can. Really good spots to find those are public lands. Public lands are an amazing gift to us. If you travel around the world and try to get off the beaten track, it's surprisingly hard to find acreage that you can legally wander through that looks like ours. I don't know what it is about, the West Coast, but we've got a lot. We've got, many, many thousands of acres of wonderful land that you can wander in for days without meeting a soul. And that's pretty special. So I've just thrown a few maps to remind you that you can go online and find maps, lists of places to try. All year long, outside of mushroom season, I recommend road trips to parks. Drive as far back on the old dirt roads as you can. Get out and scope out the environment, because a really good chanterelle patch in the fall looks like a really good chanterelle patch in the spring too. There's just no chanterelles. And then just promise, put a mark on your map and come back. So state parks, got a lot of them. Pretty good picking regulations. I think it's 2 gallons a day, if I recall correctly, at most state parks. Most of them are very popular. Most of them have, campgrounds and picnic grounds and lakes and canoes but they also tend to have backcountry that tends not to be cut down. And so you tend to have 40 and 50-year-old forests on the edges of the trail system that are pretty good for finding mushrooms. I have found, I'm just randomly looking at names of state parks. Well, I have found mushrooms. I have found them at Fort Flagler and Fort Worden, and, well, not really Fort Worden, Fort Townsend, yes. Mystery Bay, well, that's just a boat launch. But Anderson Lake Park, yes, there's mushrooms there. And let's go, Shine Tidelands, the uplands there, yes. Kitsap Memorial, yes. If you look at, this is what, the list of the South Puget Sound state parks, Scenic Beach, yes. Don't tell anybody. There's a lot of good mushrooms there. Dosu Wallops, yes. There's a lot of good picking to be found well off the trail in our state parks. National parks are a completely different story. They're huge, lots of backcountry, but a different ethic to them, of course. It is actually really hard to determine whether or not you can legally pick a mushroom in North Cascades, Mount Rainier, or Olympic National Park. You can usually find somewhere on the website of those parks the rules for picking mushrooms in that park. You can also usually find a page that says you are not allowed to pick mushrooms in this park. So I would carry a copy of both pages with you, because I have been stared at by a ranger in the Olympics while I was very carefully filling my 1-quart container with some nice mushrooms. But I'd say it's worth it to go explore. The best deal in town is the national forests, because they, well, bad news about national forests is they do get cut down. They are on that 40-year schedule. They get cut down in big patches. But before that, they have an incredible road system. They have an incredible trail system. They're huge. The backcountry goes on forever. If you go up there on a Wednesday, you've got nobody there with you. And you can walk for miles and explore and find all sorts of habitat in all of these. So Olympic, and they all have, their picking regulations are friendly but complicated. 1, 2, 3, 5 gallons. 20 per year, no, 9 per year, no, 3 per year. Yes, you need a piece of paper. No, don't need a piece of paper. Yes, you got to get the piece of paper at the radio station. No, you can get it off, online. The rules are stupid, but there's mushrooms out there. Olympic National Forest is a terrific place to just wander because you can find them. Gifford Pinchot National Forest, for some reason, because of the distance, we don't talk about it here very much. It's an amazing place in the fall. There's a lot of very, very good mushroom patches and not that many roads, so just lots of miles that you can walk and pick. Okanagan and Wenatchee Combined National Forest is where we pick the morels in the springtime. And all you need is a piece of paper in your pocket. And except that their patches keep catching fire, the morel picking and the rules and the regulations and the countryside is just amazing, and it's worth camping out there. Mount Baker Snoqualmie is basically the front range of the Cascades. It's damp land picking. It's oddly harder to find good mushrooms there than say in the Olympics. Don't know why. I think maybe it's just the undergrowth is too thick. But also the rules are a little complicated, but nevertheless, especially up near the Cascade Crest, really good picking. I can't tell you much about Colville or Panhandle. And Oregon, if you visit Oregon a lot, visit their national forests, they have completely different rules, which I urge you to check out. And that's it for where to find them. I mean, my two messages really are, fir trees and hemlock trees are your friends, learn to identify them, and the national forests are your best bet. Thanks.
All right. I feel like people are getting a little antsy. This is taking a long time, so I'm going to be kind of quick on this one.
Okay, yeah, we
When?
got other stuff to do. Yeah.
When do mushrooms grow? Fungi does not abide by human time. Fungi does respond to moisture. However, it doesn't respond right away, usually. So if it rains tonight, you're like, yay, you run out to your chanterelle patch. If they're not going to be there yet, it's going to take a while. The ground's got to saturate. The mycelium's kind of waking up. It's got to go into reproductive cycle and then push these fruiting bodies up from the ground. It takes, in my experience, after the heavy rain set in, as much as 2 weeks before we really start seeing good mushrooms popping up. It's always raining somewhere in the world. I asked my friend Alan Rockefeller, travels the world constantly studying mushrooms, and I asked him, do you ever just want to go home and just stop traveling and just relax? And he goes, yeah, on the days when it's not raining anywhere in the world. So when it's summer here, it's winter down in the southern hemisphere, and they got a ton of mushrooms right now, and it's almost our turn. Fungi does respond to temperature. Any cultivator would abundantly confirm this. So not only do we need rain, but the temperatures come down, and then that's where we're going to start seeing a lot of mushrooms. So if you are a mushroom lover like me, you're kind of annoyed when it's another 80-something degree day. And I'm like, enough, right? Mushrooms are somewhat seasonal. So over here at Gyromitra, Montana, the morels, they're spring mushrooms. They go from frozen ground, the ground warms up, and these mushrooms kind of like it that way. And then some mushrooms prefer warm to cool ground. So hot summer ground, now it gets wet and it cools down. That's the majority of our mushrooms grow in the autumn. I've never found a morel or a Gyromitra like this growing in the fall. And I've never found one of these kind of porcinis or a golden chanterelle growing in the spring. They just seem to like that weather cycle. Right here, some mushrooms that only grow in the spring, Morchella norvengensis. This was found in Banner Forest, beautiful spring morels. Tree conchs, equal opportunity. They grow all year round, evergreen mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms, a wild card. You can find those in the spring, throughout summer, in fall. I've even found them in the dead of winter. Chanterelles, summer and autumn, but they seem to like autumn. Candy caps, those smell a lot like maple syrup. They're great in desserts. At our picnic, we had little Chinese donuts that were dusted with the candy cap powder. It was so good. But they seem to like it when it starts really getting cold, when it starts to frost. I find them in late November, early December. So get out there and get your mushrooms. Thanks so much for joining us.